Gosen, a former budget director, but here today in my capacity as a senior fellow with the Kansas Center for Economic Growth. Together with my colleague, Kansas Center for Economic Growth Executive Director Annie McKay, we are here to talk about the budget options that the Brownback administration outlined last week and what those options really mean for Kansas. We are pleased to be joined by Shannon Katsourotis, President and CEO of Kansas Action for Children, Bob Totten, Executive Vice President of the Kansas Contractors Association, Rebecca Proctor, Executive Director of the Kansas Organization for State Employees, and Mark DeSetti, Director of Legislative and Political Advocacy at Kansas NEA. Later today, the legislature reconvenes for the annual wrap-up session, and there is no question that there are some very difficult decisions ahead. Last week, the Brownback administration offered the Kansas legislature 3 options to balance the state budget for this fiscal year and next. Unfortunately, the structural deficit that we are experiencing is unprecedented, and the options we've been given are not solutions. Here's option 1. Dismantle Kansas's premier system for early childhood education, further defund the state's vital transportation infrastructure, and backtrack on commitments to Kansas retirees. Or option 2, backtrack on commitments to Kansas retirees, find $25 million somewhere, anywhere, and further defund the state's vital transportation infrastructure. Or option 3, further defund the state's vital transportation infrastructure, implement yet another round of damaging across-the-board cuts, including $57 million from K-12 education, and backtrack on commitments to Kansas retirees. All of these options have already been overutilized in the last 5 years as short-term budget stopgaps. All of them come with serious long-term consequences for Kansas families, children, and the economy. None of these options, none of them solve the state's long-term budget crisis. Even the governor admits that these are bridges, one-time fixes, gimmicks, until the next budget crisis begins next year. None of these options are fiscally responsible, and none of them are acceptable. What many Kansans may not realize is that the tax changes implemented in 2012 came on the heels of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. In the 18 months before Governor Brownback took office, state spending was reduced by over $1 billion. It was a shared sacrifice. Everyone standing before you today shared some of the pain. It was supposed to be temporary, but you all know that's not how things have played out. And now, when you add the pain of the Great Recession to the cost of the Brownback tax experiment, we face a truly dire financial situation. The partners with us today are here because they each represent constituencies that will bear the brunt of the governor's 3 budget options. And Kansans deserve to know exactly what the governor's most recent proposal will do to our state. With that, I'll turn over to Kansas Action for Children President and CEO, Shannon Katsourotis.
Not quite as tall as Dwayne. Thanks, Dwayne. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to explain how Kansas's youngest and most vulnerable children will be impacted by the budget options Governor Brownback offered last week. This is not the first time this legislative session that Governor Brownback has attempted to dismantle Kansas's early childhood infrastructure. In January, the governor claimed he wanted to eliminate the Children's Initiatives Fund to streamline education at all levels. When that failed, Senate Bill 463 appeared under the guise of increasing transparency in early childhood funding. Now we know these repeated attempts to abolish or sidestep the Children's Initiatives Fund have all been a concerted effort to sell its revenue source to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. Or as the administration described it last Wednesday, option number one. The CIF is the cornerstone of funding for our early care and education system in Kansas. In fact, nearly every program that serves young children in Kansas has received or currently receives CIF funding. While there's a long list of things that give me pause about option number one, 3 things keep me awake at night. Regardless of what the administration claims, any MSA securitization requires the removal of all protections currently in place for funding children's programs. Although the Key Fund and the CIF have endured budget sweeps in the past, the current structure has successfully safeguarded funding for early childhood programs for nearly 20 years. Removing those protections during the worst financial crisis in the state's history would put these programs at risk immediately. Second, MSA securitization will all but ensure a 3rd credit rating downgrade for Kansas. Just 2 days ago, Standard & Poor's put Kansas on a negative credit watch, using bond proceeds to temporarily close a budget gap, which is exactly what Governor Brownback wants to do with tobacco settlement funds, without addressing the underlying structural cause of the crisis, makes yet another statewide credit downgrade highly likely. A 3rd credit rating drop over a 2-year period would not only wreak havoc on the Kansas economy, it would do so while dismantling the early childhood infrastructure on which babies and toddlers depend. Finally, the administration has repeatedly demonstrated poor management of Kansas finances. If the legislature gives the governor authority to negotiate, these are the clear problems with the securitization component of option number one. But what I find concerning about all of these proposals is that the governor presented them as if they're free of long-term consequences. That's simply and blatantly untrue. Option number one will have devastating consequences for Kansas kids, but so will option number 2, and so will option number 3. That's because we're all in this together. The important work we accomplish during the first 5 years of life can't be as effective if the system crumbles during the K-12 years. And speaking of crumbling, unsafe roads and bridges, they don't make for family-friendly environments. None of these options work for Kansas families, which is why none of these options work for Kansas Action for Children. At this time, I'd like to introduce Bob Totten with the Kansas Contractors Association.
Bob Totten, I'm the Executive Vice President for the Kansas Contractors Association. We have over 235 companies that build the roads and bridges that you use today to get here to this news conference and this event. We join basically to echo our concerns over the financial plight of the state of Kansas and would like to see the tax exemptions restored that were put in place in 2012. As you all know, the Department of Transportation has turned into the bank of KDOT, and state leaders have chosen to divert at least $2.42 billion out of an $8 billion program in the last 6 years. It means that roads and bridges are not being repaired at the rate that our citizens expected 6 years ago. In 2016 alone, instead of preserving 1,200 miles of road, the state is now fixing only 200 miles. That means that instead of touching a piece of pavement approximately every 12 years, that piece of pavement will be touched by KDOT or its contractors once every 50 years. Can you imagine any road going to be in good shape if it's only going to be touched once in 50 years? And in the case of bridges, KDOT is only addressing 58 bridges where they repair or paint them. Out of 25,000 bridges in the state, only 58 are going to be fixed this year. They normally fix 115, but it's now down to less than half. The safety of our citizens is at risk when our road system is not adequately repaired or replaced. For years, KDOT officials have said the loss of revenues would not hurt our state road system. But unfortunately, last week, KDOT unveiled a plan to delay or suspend 25 projects and hopefully get them put back in place by the mid-2019. Those projects are what communities wanted 10 years ago when the T-Link Committee went around the state and listened to everybody's concerns. The delayed projects, which were scheduled through mid-2019 include work that would have widened shoulders, flattened hills, and straightened curves, and added passing lanes and greater capacity to the state's highway system. I believe these projects will never be completed because there's not an adequate revenue stream presently in place to make sure that that's going to happen in the next several years. Potholes will become an everyday appearance in the future, and our roads and bridges will look like they did back in the mid-'80s. And with freight doubling approximately every 8 years, the new modernization and expansion projects necessary to move our farm products to market will suffer. Our organization is urging lawmakers to reinstate the income taxes that were put in place, the exemption that was put in place in 2012. We believe the state is suffering in various categories, including highways, and we'd like to see that stop. I thank you for your attention. I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Proctor. I'm the Executive Director for the Kansas Organization of State Employees. We represent over 8,000 executive branch state employees in every single county of our state. The employees we represent are employees who work for KDOT, maintaining your roads, employees who work in our Kansas correctional facilities, keeping your communities safe, employees who work in our state hospitals. The last several years have been disastrous for state employees and for all of the Kansas citizens that our state employees serve. And these options would do nothing to improve that catastrophe, but instead would only make it worse. If you've been keeping up with the news articles, you know that our state hospitals are understaffed. You know that one of our state hospitals has lost certification. You know at one of the others, employees are working 16 to 20 hours a day, 4 to 5 days a week. Our correctional facilities are operating below safe minimum staffing levels. Lansing Correctional Facility, which has a maximum security unit, regularly operates 2 to 3 positions below the identified safe minimum staffing level. These cuts endanger your roads, your communities, the safety of our mentally ill, and the safety of our state employees. Our state employees have not had either a pay increase or a cost of living increase since 2009. And yet they've been asked to make higher contributions to their retirement system and for their health benefits. They have had a de facto pay cut. This obviously makes it harder to attract qualified employees. In fact, many of our state agencies have now changed the qualifications to hold positions. We have environmental scientist positions at the Department of Health and Environment that used to require advanced degrees and 8 years in the field that now require a high school diploma and no real world experience. And these are the people making the decisions about emissions in your air, pollution in your water. These are harmful cuts. And these options that were presented by the governor only make those cuts worse. We don't hear a lot when these options are presented about the long-term impacts or even the immediate impacts, other than this will fill the budget hole. When we as Kansas families make decisions about our own finances, we weigh the costs and benefits of all of those options. And that's something that has not occurred in this place, in this environment. We have instead been offered 4 options with absolutely no impacts tied to any of them. We've also been offered a false choice. We don't believe any of the 3 options before you or before our legislature are the right options for our state. We believe we need to look at the long-term health of all of our Kansas communities and explore option 4. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark DeSetti, Director of Legislative Advocacy for the Kansas National Education Association.
Good morning. I'm apparently not as tall as Rebecca. In repealing the school finance formula and replacing it with a block grant system, Governor Brownback and legislative leaders promised that our K-12 schools would have, if not better funding, at least stable funding. It was funding that schools could count on. Well, we're now on the edge of yet another broken promise to our children and teachers. The loss of funding provided in response to the Montoy decision, the loss of funding provided in response to the Montoy decision was a result not of legislative action, but as a result and a response to the Great Recession. We were sorry to see those cuts happen, but we expected it to be temporary, fixed when the economy recovered. But instead of restoring recession-era cuts, this governor and legislature implemented a plan that has turned out, in effect, to be a self-inflicted recession when it comes to generating necessary revenue for state services. While every indicator tells us that this experiment is a failure, the legislature continues on the same dangerous path, even doubling down. Now they propose to sell off a program that has been providing quality early childhood programs for Kansas children. They continue to drain funds from important highway projects, jeopardizing our safety. They turn their backs on hardworking Kansans, putting their retirement security in jeopardy. They propose driving up the cost of higher education with extended cuts. And now they threaten to slash funding to our K-12 schools. As our schools drop days from their calendars, reduce to a 4-day week, and eliminate valuable programs and staff positions, we cannot be more certain that there must be an option 4, an option our governor continues to sidestep. It's time to return to a stable, dependable, and fair tax system. It's time to put option 4 on the table. The definition of insanity, it is said, is to continue doing the same thing and expecting different results. It's time that we stepped away from this Kansas tax insanity. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to KCEG Executive Director Annie McKay.
Seriously, somebody took my notebook. Where's Haley? Well, a little levity. Thank you, Mark. Get back to our regularly scheduled program. Thank you to everyone who could join us here today. I know you all, both reporters and advocates, have been following this fiscal train wreck for quite some time. You might not have known the specifics of Governor Brownback's latest round of proposals and what they would do to the various constituencies before you, but you knew that it wouldn't be good. We're talking about the complete dismantling of the state's early childhood education system. We're talking about the defunding of the state's prized and essential highway system. We're talking about the retirement security of thousands of Kansas's current and future retirees. And we're talking about devastating cuts to an underfunded public education system that already forced districts to consider closing early, forced class sizes to rise across the state, and caused schools to eliminate nurses, counselors, and librarians because they literally had no other options. I'm a data person, and I'm not one for hyperbole, but what I've just described isn't bad, it's catastrophic. And we're only about 20% of the way on the march to zero. Kansas still gets 40% of its revenue from income tax, which means catastrophic is actually just the starting point. Unfortunately, the current administration has a long history of presenting false choices. But the truth is that this is not, nor should it ever be, an either-or choice. Kansans shouldn't have to choose between high-quality early childhood programs, or safe roads, or a school that can afford to stay open 5 days a week, or affordable college tuition, or a retirement they rightfully earned. Kansans deserve and need all of these things. These are critical, proven investments in our communities, and they all work together to create prosperity for our entire state. Which is why we're all standing together today. We're here to call for option number 4, an end to the Brownback tax experiment. The administration keeps telling us to give it time. We were told 2 years ago this tax plan was like a surgery, after being told it would be like a shot of adrenaline. We just needed to allow time to heal, and yet we're still hemorrhaging. We're out of time. We're on the verge of our 3rd statewide credit rating downgrade in 3 years. The latest budget shortfall is not expected to go away. We're not paying our bills on time. We're considering the permanent dismantling and defunding of Kansas's most successful programs. How much worse does it have to get? We will never revive the Kansas economy if all we ever do is damage control and crisis management. The damage done over the last few years can only be repaired if our fiscal outlook improves right now. And the only way to repair our fiscal outlook is to finally fix the problem. And that's what we're calling on the governor and legislators to do. Thank you all for being here today. For those of you in the room who are media, we'll allow some time for questions for individually. We're not going to stand at the podium and take questions, but thank you for your time and your attention to these issues.